I walked into my home office that Tuesday evening, loosened my tie, and sat down at my desk with the same routine I'd followed for 12 years of marriage. Rachel was downstairs preparing dinner, humming some tune I didn't recognize, and everything seemed perfectly normal in our suburban Connecticut life. I opened my laptop to review some contracts for work when a notification popped up on the screen. An email from an address I didn't recognize with the subject line reading, "You need to see this." My finger hovered over the delete button because I assumed it was spam, but something in my gut told me to click it, and that single decision would unravel everything I thought I knew about my life. The email contained a single line of text and an attachment. "I'm sorry to be the one to tell you this, but your wife isn't who you think she is." My hands started trembling as I downloaded the file, telling myself it was probably a scam or some cruel joke from a competitor at the firm, but when the images loaded onto my screen, my world collapsed in an instant. The photos were explicit, time-stamped, and undeniably featured my wife Rachel with a man I recognized immediately from our social circle. Bob Henderson worked at my father-in-law's investment firm, a charismatic vice president who'd been to our house for dinner parties at least a dozen times, always with his wife Linda by his side, always seeming like the perfect couple. I stared at the screen until my eyes burned, counting the dates on the images and realizing this wasn't a one-time mistake or a moment of weakness. This had been going on for at least 8 months based on the metadata, maybe longer. And every Tuesday when Rachel told me she had book club, every Saturday when she said she was meeting her sister, every late evening when she claimed to be at the gym, she'd been with him. The anonymous sender had included hotel receipts, text message screenshots, and even a video clip that I couldn't bring myself to watch more than 5 seconds of before slamming my laptop shut. I sat there in the darkness of my office, listening to Rachel still humming downstairs, and something cold and calculated began to form in my chest where my heart used to be. I didn't confront Rachel that night, or the next day, or even the next week. Instead, I called a friend from law school who'd gone into private investigation work, a guy named Marcus who specialized in corporate espionage and infidelity cases. When I met him at a coffee shop downtown, I slid the USB drive across the table and told him I needed everything, every detail, every location, every communication between my wife and Bob Henderson that he could possibly uncover. Marcus looked at me with that expression people get when they know you're about to go down a dark path, but he took the drive anyway and told me he'd have a full report within 2 weeks. I spent those 14 days acting like nothing had changed, kissing Rachel goodbye in the mornings, asking about her day over dinner, even making love to her twice while imagining Bob's face the whole time. The performance was easier than I expected, because I'd already emotionally detached from her, already started viewing her as an opponent in a game she didn't even know we were playing yet. Marcus delivered his report on a Thursday afternoon, a thick manila envelope that felt heavy with betrayal. I sat in my car in the parking garage of my office building and read through every page, learning details I wished I could unlearn but needed to know. The affair had started at a company retreat in the Hamptons, where Bob had apparently cornered Rachel at the hotel bar and told her she was wasted on a paper-pushing attorney like me. They'd been meeting at the Cortland Hotel every Tuesday afternoon, always room 412, and Bob had been charging it to a corporate account that was supposedly for client entertainment. The text messages were worse than the photos because they showed intimacy beyond the physical, inside jokes and future plans, and Rachel telling him things about our marriage that she'd never said to my face. In one message, she called me predictable and boring. In another, she complained that I was emotionally unavailable. And in a third, she actually laughed about how I never suspected anything because I was too trusting and naive. Reading those words felt like being stabbed repeatedly with a dull knife, but I didn't cry or scream or punch my steering wheel like I thought I would. Instead, I started planning. Bob Henderson had built his entire career on his marriage to Linda Carmichael, whose father owned Carmichael Capital Management, a private equity firm worth over $200 million. Bob had no family money of his own, came from a middle-class background in Ohio, and had basically married into wealth and power when he charmed Linda at some charity gala 15 years ago. His position as vice president wasn't earned through merit or experience. It was given to him as a wedding gift by his father-in-law, and everyone in their social circle knew it, even if nobody said it out loud. Linda herself came from old Connecticut money, the kind of family that had buildings named after them at Yale. And from what I knew of her, she was calculating and image-obsessed in the way only generational wealth can make someone. If I could get proof of Bob's affair to Linda, I realized, I wouldn't just be exposing his betrayal. I'd be detonating a bomb under his entire existence. He'd lose his wife, his job, his house in Greenwich, his country club membership, his standing in society, everything that made him feel superior to people like me who actually earned their positions. I spent the next 2 weeks carefully crafting my approach, because I knew I'd only get one shot at this, and it had to be perfect. Marcus helped me compile everything into a comprehensive dossier. Hotel records, credit card statements showing jewelry purchases that Linda never received, text messages, photos, even a timeline that showed Bob was supposedly in client meetings during hours when he was actually in bed with my wife. I had everything printed on high-quality paper, organized in a leather portfolio that looked professional and devastating at the same time. The question was how to deliver it to Linda in a way that would cause maximum damage, and after considering several options, I decided on the most public and humiliating route possible. The Carmichael family was hosting their annual charity gala in 3 weeks, a black tie event at the Greenwich Country Club that drew everyone who mattered in Connecticut's business and social circles, and both Bob and Linda would be there playing the perfect couple for all their wealthy friends. I bought a ticket to the gala using my firm's name, which wasn't unusual since several attorneys from my office attended every year for networking purposes. Rachel mentioned she was going to have dinner with her sister that night, which I knew meant she'd be meeting Bob somewhere while Linda was occupied at the event, and the irony of the timing was almost poetic. The 3 weeks crawled by with excruciating slowness as I maintained my facade at home. But inside, I was counting down the hours until I could destroy Bob Henderson's life the same way he'd destroyed mine. I didn't tell Marcus about my plan for the gala because I knew he'd try to talk me out of it, warn me about making a scene or potential legal consequences. But I was beyond caring about any of that. The old Ethan, who played by the rules and trusted people and believed in doing things the right way, had died the moment I opened that anonymous email, and whoever I was now had no problem with public humiliation. The night of the gala arrived with unseasonably warm weather for October in Connecticut. I put on my best tuxedo, the Tom Ford one I'd bought for a senior partner's wedding but rarely wore because it felt too flashy for my personality. Rachel was already gone, claiming she needed to leave early to help her sister move some furniture, and she'd kissed my cheek on her way out the door like she always did, like she wasn't about to spend the evening in bed with another woman's husband. I arrived at the Greenwich Country Club just as the sun was setting, the property lit up like something from a movie, with valets taking cars and women in designer gowns gliding through the entrance. The leather portfolio was in my car trunk, wrapped in plain paper, and I left it there for the first hour while I worked the room and nursed a scotch at the bar. I watched Bob and Linda make their entrance fashionably late, her in a silver gown that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage, him in a tuxedo with diamond cufflinks that caught the light every time he shook someone's hand. They looked perfect together, the golden couple of Greenwich society, and I felt a surge of satisfaction knowing I was about to tear that image apart. I waited until after dinner, when people had spread out across the venue and the live band was playing, when enough alcohol had flowed that everyone was relaxed and unsuspecting. Linda was standing near the silent auction tables with a group of her society friends, examining some donated vacation package to Tuscany, and I approached her with the portfolio tucked under my arm like it was just another piece of business. She recognized me vaguely, gave me that polite smile that wealthy people reserve for those they consider beneath them, and asked if I was enjoying the event. I told her I was, and then I said something that made her friend group go quiet. "Linda, I need to speak with you privately about your husband. It's urgent and it concerns your family's business." Her expression shifted immediately from polite to concerned, because in her world, anything involving the family business was serious. She excused herself from her friends and led me to a private sitting room off the main ballroom, a space decorated with expensive furniture and oil paintings of people who were probably her ancestors. The moment the door closed, I handed her the portfolio and told her she needed to see what was inside before the night went any further. Linda opened it slowly, her perfectly manicured nails flipping through the first few pages, and I watched her face transform from confusion to shock to a cold, calculated fury that actually made me step back. She went through every single page methodically, taking her time, her jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscles working beneath her makeup. When she finally looked up at me, her eyes weren't filled with tears or devastation like I expected. Instead, they held something harder, something almost businesslike. She asked me in a voice that didn't waver at all who the woman was, and when I told her it was my wife Rachel, she actually laughed. This short, bitter sound that had no humor in it whatsoever. Linda closed the portfolio and held it against her chest like it was a weapon, which I suppose it was. She asked me what I wanted out of this, whether I was looking for money or revenge or what my angle was, and I told her the truth. I just wanted Bob Henderson to lose everything the way I was losing everything. She studied me for a long moment, and then she said something that surprised me. "Consider it done." She didn't ask me how I got the information, or whether I was sure about the details or any of the questions I expected. She just accepted the evidence at face value and told me to leave the gala immediately so I wouldn't be associated with what was about to happen. I walked out of that sitting room feeling like I'd just lit a fuse on a bomb, drove home to my empty house, and poured myself a drink while I waited for the explosion. Rachel came home around midnight, smelling like hotel soap and Bob's cologne, and asked me how the gala was, and I told her it was fine, just fine. One of the best nights of my life, actually. The explosion came faster than I anticipated. By Sunday morning, Bob Henderson had been removed from his position at Carmichael Capital Management, his name stripped from the company website, his office packed up by security. Linda had filed for divorce by Monday, citing adultery and requesting full custody of their 2 children, and her father had personally called every major investment firm in the tri-state area to make sure Bob would never work in finance again. The Greenwich social circle turned on Bob overnight, the same people who'd shaken his hand at dinner parties now treating him like he had a contagious disease. His country club membership was revoked, his name removed from charity board positions, and someone even spray-painted "cheater" on his Mercedes in the club parking lot. I watched it all unfold through the grapevine of professional gossip, through Marcus, who kept tabs on the situation, through the smug satisfaction of knowing I'd orchestrated Bob's complete destruction. But I still hadn't confronted Rachel because I wanted her to see what happened to people who betrayed me before I dropped the hammer on our own marriage. Rachel noticed something was wrong by Tuesday, commenting that Bob hadn't returned her texts and asking if I'd heard anything about the Hendersons through work. I told her I'd heard there was some kind of scandal, kept my voice neutral and disinterested, and watched her face go pale as she processed the implications. She made some excuse about needing to check on something and disappeared into her car for an hour, and I knew she was trying to reach Bob, trying to figure out what had happened to their perfect little affair. When she came back inside, she was shaking, and she asked me directly if I'd heard that Bob and Linda were getting divorced. I looked up from my laptop and said yes. Something about infidelity, I think. Isn't that terrible? And the way her hands trembled as she poured herself wine told me she knew their secret was out. But she still didn't confess, still didn't come clean. And that told me everything I needed to know about who she really was underneath the performance. I filed for divorce myself on Thursday, exactly 1 week after the gala, and had the papers served to Rachel at her office in front of all her coworkers. The petition cited adultery and included selected excerpts from her text messages with Bob, nothing too explicit but enough to make it clear she'd been caught. I moved out that same day, staying with Marcus while my attorney handled the separation, and I didn't leave Rachel a forwarding address or phone number where she could reach me. I wanted her to sit in that house alone and think about what she'd lost, to feel the same betrayal and abandonment I'd felt reading those messages. My attorney told me the divorce would be straightforward since we had no children, and Connecticut is a no-fault state, but that we could push for a favorable settlement given her adultery. I told him I didn't care about the money or the house or any of it. I just wanted to be free of her and move on with my life, to put this chapter behind me and never look back. The divorce was finalized in 6 months, mercifully quick and relatively painless from a legal standpoint. Rachel didn't contest anything, probably because she knew she had no leg to stand on morally, and we split our assets down the middle like we were dividing up furniture. I heard through mutual friends that Bob had moved back to Ohio, living with his parents and working some middle management job that probably paid a fraction of what he'd made at Carmichael Capital. Linda had apparently gotten everything in their divorce: the house, the kids, the investment accounts. And Bob had walked away with basically nothing except his shame. The poetic justice of it all felt satisfying in a cold, empty way that I didn't want to examine too closely. I threw myself into my work, took on bigger cases, started traveling more for the firm, did everything I could to avoid thinking about the wreckage of my personal life. My friends and family kept telling me I needed to process what happened, maybe see a therapist or take some time off. But I didn't want to process anything. I wanted to move forward and pretend the last 12 years had been someone else's life. 3 years passed in this way. 3 years of building a new identity as a divorced workaholic who'd been burned by love and wasn't interested in trying again. I made partner at my firm, bought a condo in Manhattan, started dating casually but never seriously, because I couldn't trust anyone enough to let them close. The wounds from Rachel's betrayal had scarred over but never really healed, and I found myself constantly suspicious of people's motives, always looking for hidden agendas and secret betrayals. Marcus told me I needed to let it go, that holding on to the anger was only hurting me, but I didn't know how to let go of something that had fundamentally changed who I was. Then one Tuesday evening, exactly 3 years after I'd first discovered Rachel's affair, I received another anonymous email, this one with a subject line that made my blood run cold. You were played. The email was longer this time, written in a professional tone that suggested the sender knew exactly what they were doing. It explained that I needed to look into the timeline of Bob Henderson's divorce from Linda Carmichael more carefully, particularly the settlement negotiations and the corporate restructuring that had happened at Carmichael Capital Management in the months following the scandal. The sender included links to public business filings, news articles about the company, and a suggestion that I hire a forensic accountant to examine the money trail. At first, I thought it was some kind of scam or someone trying to drag me back into old drama. But the specificity of the information and the professional presentation made me curious enough to follow up. I contacted Marcus and asked him to look into it discreetly, to see if there was any truth to the suggestion that something bigger had been happening behind the scenes of Bob's downfall. He was reluctant at first, warning me that reopening old wounds was a bad idea, but I insisted, and he agreed to do some preliminary digging. What Marcus uncovered over the next month made me physically sick. Linda Carmichael hadn't been blindsided by Bob's affair at all. In fact, she'd known about it for at least 3 months before I delivered that portfolio at the gala. Marcus found email records through a subpoena for an unrelated business matter that showed Linda had hired her own private investigator in July, months before I'd discovered Rachel's betrayal, and that investigator had compiled a similar dossier on Bob's infidelity. But instead of confronting Bob or filing for divorce immediately, Linda had done nothing, just sat on the information and waited. The timing became clear when Marcus pulled corporate filings showing that Linda's father had been planning to restructure Carmichael Capital, creating a new CEO position, and pushing Bob out of his VP role anyway due to underperformance. The restructuring was scheduled for early the following year, and it would have included a significant severance package for Bob due to his employment contract and his status as family. Linda had needed a way to terminate Bob without paying him a dime, and my public revelation of his affair at the gala had been the perfect solution. Marcus showed me the divorce settlement documents, revealed that Bob had walked away with nothing because of the morality clause in his employment contract and prenuptial agreement, clauses that were only enforceable if his infidelity was publicly exposed and documented. If Linda had simply filed for divorce quietly based on her private investigator's findings, Bob's attorneys could have argued the evidence was obtained improperly or that Linda had condoned the behavior by not acting immediately. But my very public, very documented revelation, delivered by a third party with no connection to Linda's family, had been legally ironclad and impossible to dispute. The more I learned, the more I realized I'd been used, turned into Linda's weapon without ever knowing it. And that realization made me want to destroy something all over again. But the revelation that truly broke me came when Marcus dug deeper into how I'd received that first anonymous email, the one that had started this entire chain of events. He traced the email through multiple servers and proxy accounts, eventually identifying the original sender as someone who'd been paid through a consulting firm that did work for Carmichael Capital Management. The payment had been authorized by Linda Carmichael herself, months before I received the email, which meant she'd actively arranged for me to discover my wife's affair at exactly the right time to serve her purposes. Marcus couldn't prove definitively that Linda had orchestrated the entire thing, but the circumstantial evidence was overwhelming. She'd known about Bob's affair. She'd known I was Rachel's husband. She'd arranged for me to get the evidence at exactly the moment when she needed someone outside her family to expose Bob publicly. I'd thought I was the one pulling the strings, the puppet master orchestrating Bob's downfall, when in reality, I'd been the puppet all along. The final piece of the puzzle came when Marcus found business filings showing that Rachel had received a consulting payment from a shell company connected to Carmichael Capital, a payment of $50,000 made 2 weeks after my divorce from her was finalized. The payment was labeled as marketing consulting services, but Rachel had no background in marketing and had never worked in that field. Marcus tracked down the shell company's corporate structure and found that it was wholly owned by another company, which was ultimately controlled by a trust managed by Linda Carmichael. The implication was clear and devastating. Rachel had been working with Linda, or at least had been compensated by Linda for her role in the scheme. Whether Rachel had started the affair with Bob at Linda's direction, or whether Linda had simply discovered the affair and recruited Rachel afterward, I couldn't know for certain. But either way, my wife's betrayal had been part of a larger conspiracy. I confronted Rachel about it on a cold November evening, showing up at her apartment unannounced with Marcus's entire report. She'd remarried by then, some accountant she'd met through work, and she answered the door in yoga pants and an expression of surprise that quickly turned to fear when she saw my face. I walked past her into the apartment without waiting for an invitation, spread the documents across her kitchen table, and told her I knew everything. At first, she tried to deny it, claimed the consulting payment was legitimate work she'd done, but when I showed her the corporate structure linking the payment directly to Linda Carmichael, her face crumbled. She sat down at the table and started crying, these pathetic, heaving sobs that I felt absolutely nothing for. And eventually, she told me the truth I'd already pieced together but needed to hear from her lips. Rachel admitted that Linda had approached her 4 months into her affair with Bob, showing up at a coffee shop where Rachel had a regular Tuesday morning routine. Linda had laid out the entire situation calmly and businesslike. She knew about the affair. She had evidence. And she was going to destroy both Bob and Rachel unless Rachel cooperated. The cooperation Linda wanted was simple. Rachel needed to continue the affair long enough for Linda to arrange for me to discover it at exactly the right time, and Rachel needed to make sure there was plenty of electronic evidence for me to find. In exchange, Linda would compensate Rachel financially and ensure that Rachel emerged from our divorce with her reputation intact in her professional circles. Rachel had been terrified of what Linda would do if she refused. Apparently, Linda had shown her evidence that could have destroyed Rachel's career and social standing, so she'd agreed to the arrangement. She claimed she'd never meant to hurt me, that the affair with Bob had been real initially before Linda got involved, but that everything after Linda's intervention had been orchestrated. I asked Rachel if she'd loved Bob at all, or if that had been part of the performance too, and she admitted she didn't know anymore. That it had started as real attraction but became something hollow once she knew it was being managed by Linda. The $50,000 payment had been made after our divorce finalized, transferred through the shell company structure to make it look legitimate, and Rachel had used it as a down payment on her current apartment. She'd signed a non-disclosure agreement as part of receiving the payment, which was why she'd never told anyone about Linda's involvement, and she genuinely believed I would never find out about the conspiracy. Hearing all of this in her tear-stained voice, watching her try to justify her choices and paint herself as a victim of Linda's manipulation, I felt something break inside me that had been barely holding together for 3 years. I'd spent those years believing I'd had power and control in the situation, that I'd been the architect of Bob's downfall, when in reality I'd been nothing more than a tool. I left Rachel's apartment that night without another word, drove back to Manhattan in a blur of rage and humiliation, and seriously considered tracking down Linda Carmichael to confront her about what she'd done. But Marcus talked me down, pointing out that Linda could claim everything was coincidence, that I had no definitive proof she'd orchestrated the anonymous email or coerced Rachel into anything, and that confronting a woman with her resources and connections would probably end badly for me. He was right, of course, which made it worse because it meant Linda would get away with using me, with playing me like a chess piece, and there was nothing I could do about it. I'd destroyed Bob Henderson's life thinking I was getting justice, when really I'd just been the weapon Linda used to destroy her husband without getting blood on her own hands. The realization that both women had conspired to manipulate me, that they'd sat somewhere together planning out how to use my pain and anger for their own purposes, was more devastating than Rachel's original betrayal had been. For weeks after learning the truth, I obsessed over every detail of the timeline, trying to figure out exactly when Linda had made her decision to use me. Had she seen me at some social event and identified me as the perfect patsy? Had she researched Bob's affair specifically looking for a betrayed spouse she could manipulate? Or had it been opportunistic, a plan that came together when she discovered who Rachel's husband was and realized what she could accomplish by pushing the situation in the right direction? The not knowing ate at me worse than the betrayal itself, because it meant I couldn't even understand how I'd been played. Marcus eventually told me I needed to let it go, that understanding the mechanics of the manipulation wouldn't change what had happened, but I couldn't stop picking at it like a wound that wouldn't heal. I started drinking more than I should have, spending evenings in my Manhattan condo with a bottle of scotch and Marcus's investigation files spread across my coffee table like evidence at a crime scene. My work performance suffered enough that one of the senior partners called me into his office to ask if everything was okay, and I lied and said I was dealing with some family issues. The truth was, I couldn't focus on contracts and depositions when my entire understanding of my own life had been rewritten, when every memory from those months of planning Bob's downfall was now tainted with the knowledge that I'd been dancing to someone else's choreography. I kept replaying conversations with Rachel from before the divorce, looking for signs that she'd been acting under duress or following Linda's script. But I couldn't separate what had been real from what had been performance. The worst part was knowing that Linda Carmichael was out there somewhere, probably never thinking about me at all, while I was consumed with thoughts of how she'd manipulated me. Marcus finally staged something like an intervention, showing up at my condo on a Saturday morning with coffee and bagels and a firm instruction that I needed to either take action or move on. He laid out my options clearly. I could try to expose Linda's conspiracy, though we both knew the evidence was circumstantial, and she had the resources to bury any accusations I made. I could confront her directly and demand answers, though that would likely accomplish nothing except giving her the satisfaction of knowing she'd gotten under my skin. Or I could accept that I'd been outmaneuvered by someone smarter and more ruthless than me, learn from it, and rebuild my life without this obsession eating me alive. He was trying to be a good friend, trying to pull me back from the edge I was teetering on. But all I could think about was how Linda must have laughed when she realized her plan had worked perfectly. She'd gotten rid of her unfaithful husband without paying him a cent, probably consolidated her control over her family's company, and faced absolutely no consequences for manipulating multiple people's lives like we were pieces on a board game. The anonymous emailer reached out again 3 months later, this time with information that made me realize the conspiracy went even deeper than I'd imagined. The email contained financial records showing that Linda hadn't just orchestrated Bob's downfall, she'd also positioned herself to take over as CEO of Carmichael Capital Management within 6 months of the divorce, a role that her father had apparently been grooming her for, but couldn't justify giving her while Bob was still in the picture. The company had thrived under her leadership according to the business filings attached to the email, growing its portfolio by 40% in the first year alone. And Linda had become something of a darling in Connecticut business circles as the woman who'd taken her father's company to new heights. The email also included photographs from a charity event where Linda and Rachel were pictured together, both smiling, both dressed in expensive designer clothes, looking for all the world-like friends who'd bonded over their shared experience of betrayal by Bob Henderson. That photograph broke something in me that Marcus's intervention had been trying to hold together. The idea that Rachel and Linda had maintained some kind of relationship after everything, that they might have actually become friends through their conspiracy, was more than I could process rationally. I showed up at Linda's office building in Greenwich on a Tuesday morning, got past security by claiming I had a meeting with her assistant, and literally ambushed her in the hallway outside her office. She was wearing a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent, her hair pulled back in a severe bun, and when she saw me approaching, her expression didn't change at all, like she'd been expecting this confrontation eventually. I demanded that she talk to me, told her I knew what she'd done, and instead of calling security or acting shocked, she simply invited me into her office and closed the door behind us like we were having a scheduled business meeting. Linda's office was exactly what I expected. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Greenwich, modern furniture that screamed money, and photographs on her desk of her children at various stages of growing up without their father. She offered me coffee, which I refused, and then she sat down behind her massive desk and asked me what exactly I thought I knew. I laid out everything Marcus had uncovered, the timeline of her private investigator, the anonymous email that had been sent to me from an account linked to her company, the consulting payment to Rachel through the shell company. All of it. Linda listened without interrupting, her face completely neutral. And when I finished, she actually smiled. This cold, satisfied expression that made me understand why her business competitors feared her. She told me I was smarter than she'd given me credit for, that most people never would have connected the dots the way I had. But that being smart and being able to prove something were two entirely different things. She admitted everything, right there in her office, with a confidence that came from knowing I couldn't touch her. Linda confirmed that she'd known about Bob's affair for months before I discovered it, that she'd been planning to restructure the company and needed a clean way to remove him without the financial obligations of a standard divorce settlement. When her private investigator identified Rachel as Bob's affair partner and discovered that Rachel's husband was an attorney with a reputation for being ethical and straightforward, Linda had seen an opportunity too perfect to pass up. She'd arranged for me to receive the evidence at exactly the right time, knowing that someone with my personality type would want justice and would act in a way that was both public and well-documented. The gala had been her suggestion too, fed to me through carefully worded hints in that first anonymous email that I'd internalized as my own idea. Every step I'd taken, from hiring Marcus to compiling the dossier to confronting her at the charity event, had been anticipated and encouraged by her manipulation. Linda explained that she'd approached Rachel after confirming the affair was serious enough to use, offering Rachel a choice between being destroyed along with Bob or cooperating in exchange for protection and compensation. Rachel had chosen survival, which Linda said she respected as the logical decision, and together they'd made sure there was plenty of evidence for me to find, timing it all for maximum impact. The consulting payment had been Rachel's reward for playing her role well, for continuing the affair long enough and leaving enough of a trail for me to follow. Linda admitted she'd even coached Rachel on certain text messages to send to Bob, messages designed to make me angry enough to want revenge, but also to establish clear evidence of Bob's predatory behavior in case the divorce got messy. The whole thing had been orchestrated like a corporate takeover, which I supposed it essentially was, with me as the unwitting instrument of execution. I asked Linda how she could live with herself, using people's lives like they were just tools for her business ambitions, and she looked at me like I'd asked the stupidest question imaginable. She said Bob had betrayed her trust and damaged her family's reputation, that he'd been skimming money from company accounts and underperforming in his role, and that removing him efficiently was simply good business sense. As for me and Rachel, Linda said we'd made our own choices, that she hadn't forced me to seek revenge or Rachel to have an affair in the first place. She'd simply guided existing situations toward outcomes that benefited her. She called it strategic opportunity maximization, like it was something she'd learned in business school rather than a sociopathic manipulation of vulnerable people. When I called her a monster, she laughed and said that monsters don't build successful companies and raise well-adjusted children. that what I called manipulation she called leadership, and that the only difference between us was that she'd been better at the game we'd both been playing. Linda told me that if I tried to expose what she'd done, she'd destroy me professionally and personally with resources I couldn't even imagine. She had lawyers on retainer who specialized in making problems disappear, connections with judges and politicians throughout Connecticut, and enough money to tie me up in litigation until I was bankrupt. More importantly, she said, nobody would believe me anyway because I had no proof that couldn't be explained away as coincidence, and my claims would just make me look like a bitter ex-husband having a breakdown. She'd even prepared for this possibility, she said, having already seeded stories among her social circle about how concerned she was that I seemed to be stalking her and making wild accusations, laying groundwork in case I went public. Every move she'd made had included contingencies for the move after that, chess played several boards deep, and I finally understood that I'd never stood a chance against someone who thought like this. Before I left her office, Linda offered me something that felt like both an apology and a final insult. A check for $50,000, the same amount she'd paid Rachel, as compensation for my unwitting participation in a complex business restructuring. She said it with a straight face, like she was settling a contractor's invoice rather than trying to pay off someone whose life she'd ruined. I tore the check in half and dropped it on her desk, told her that some people couldn't be bought, and she just shrugged and said the offer would remain open if I changed my mind. As I walked out of her office, past her assistant who definitely knew something was wrong, past security who watched me carefully, I realized that Linda had won so completely that she could afford to tell me the truth, because the truth didn't matter. She'd achieved everything she wanted. Bob was destroyed, her company was thriving, and I was just another casualty of her ambition, not even significant enough to warrant her continued attention. I drove back to Manhattan in a fog of rage and helplessness, and for the first time since this entire nightmare began, I seriously considered doing something extreme. Not violence, I wasn't that far gone, but maybe going to the media with everything I knew, or filing some kind of lawsuit even knowing it would fail, just to make Linda's life difficult for a while. Marcus talked me down again when I called him from my car, practically shouting into the phone about what Linda had admitted, and he reminded me that making an enemy of someone like her would only hurt me further. He suggested I talk to a therapist, that I was showing signs of obsessive behavior and trauma response, and maybe he was right. But I couldn't imagine sitting in some office talking about my feelings when the person who'd orchestrated my suffering was out there winning at life. The breaking point came 2 months later when I saw a news article about Linda Carmichael being named Connecticut Businesswoman of the Year by some industry association. The article praised her leadership during difficult personal circumstances, her ability to grow Carmichael Capital despite going through a challenging divorce, and her commitment to mentoring other women in finance. There were quotes from business leaders calling her inspirational and resilient, and a photograph of her accepting the award in a stunning red dress, smiling like she didn't have a care in the world. The article mentioned her charitable work, her perfect children, her vision for the company's future, and I realized that in the public narrative, Linda was the hero of this story, the wronged wife who'd overcome betrayal and emerged stronger. Nobody knew what she'd really done, how many people she'd manipulated and destroyed to build that success, and nobody ever would because she'd been too smart to leave real evidence. I started following Linda's life through social media and business publications, not because I had a plan, but because I couldn't stop myself. I watched her give interviews about work-life balance and overcoming adversity, saw her post pictures with her children at their private school events, tracked her company's continued growth and success. Every achievement of hers felt like another knife in my gut, because it was all built on the wreckage of other people's lives, including mine, and she faced no consequences whatsoever. Rachel had moved on too, I discovered through mutual acquaintances, settling into her new marriage and apparently never thinking about the conspiracy she'd been part of. Bob was the only other person who'd suffered lasting damage, and even he had apparently found some peace living a simpler life in Ohio. According to a LinkedIn profile I probably shouldn't have been checked, I was the only one still trapped in the past, unable to move forward, consumed by the injustice of it all. Marcus eventually stopped taking my calls when I continued obsessing over Linda months after our confrontation, telling me that he couldn't enable my destructive behavior anymore, and that I needed professional help. My therapist, who I'd finally started seeing under pressure from my law firm, diagnosed me with something she called complex trauma response with obsessive features, and prescribed medication that I took inconsistently because I didn't want to feel numb to the anger. The anger was all I had left, the only thing that felt real in a world where I'd learned that everything could be fake, everyone could be acting, and the only truth was that powerful people could destroy you without even trying very hard. My work performance continued to decline until the senior partners suggested I take a sabbatical, which was really code for, get your shit together or you're fired. And I agreed because I was tired of pretending to care about other people's legal problems when my own life was such a disaster. During my sabbatical, I did something I probably should have done years ago. I tracked down the anonymous emailer who'd been feeding me information about Linda's conspiracy. Marcus had identified a digital trail that led to a former employee of Carmichael Capital, someone who'd been fired during Linda's restructuring and apparently held a grudge. I found him living in Hartford, working as a consultant for smaller investment firms, and when I showed up at his apartment demanding answers, he let me in like he'd been expecting me eventually. His name was David, and he'd been Bob's assistant at Carmichael Capital before Linda cleaned house after the divorce. He admitted he'd sent me those anonymous emails out of spite, wanting to expose what Linda had done because she'd cost him his career by association with Bob. But he'd also done it because he genuinely thought I deserved to know the truth. David confirmed everything Linda had admitted to me and added details that made the conspiracy even more elaborate than I'd realized. According to David, Linda had been planning Bob's removal for over a year before the affair even started, building a case about his underperformance and financial irregularities. When her private investigator discovered the affair, it had been like a gift from the universe, a perfect excuse that would let her avoid paying Bob anything in the divorce and would make her look sympathetic rather than calculating. David had been in meetings where Linda discussed managing the situation for optimal outcomes, where she'd literally referred to me as the trigger mechanism in her plan. He'd kept copies of some internal memos and emails that showed Linda's cold-blooded calculation, and he offered to give them to me, saying maybe I could do something with them that he couldn't. I took the documents knowing they probably wouldn't change anything, but at least having concrete proof felt like something, even if that something was just validation that I hadn't been crazy or paranoid. The documents David gave me were damning if you knew what you were looking for, but they were also carefully worded to maintain plausible deniability. Linda never explicitly stated she was manipulating me, but there were references to ensuring the external exposure happens at the correct time and managing the husband's response for maximum impact. There were budget allocations for strategic communications consulting that lined up with when Rachel received her payment, and there were notes from meetings about reputation management protocols that clearly referred to the aftermath of Bob's exposure. It was all corporate speak that could be explained away as standard crisis management if anyone questioned it, but reading between the lines, it was clear evidence of premeditation and manipulation. I considered taking it to a lawyer to see if there was any legal action I could pursue, but I already knew what they'd say. It wasn't enough for a criminal case, and a civil case would be expensive and likely unsuccessful against someone with Linda's resources. Instead, I did something that surprised even me. I wrote everything down, the entire story from start to finish, including David's documents and Marcus's investigation files, and my own contemporaneous notes from when I thought I was the one in control. I wrote it as a cautionary tale about power and manipulation, about how easily someone can be turned into a weapon without ever knowing they're being used. I didn't use real names or identifying details, changing enough that nobody could definitively prove it was about Linda Carmichael. But anyone who knew the situation would recognize it immediately. I self-published it as an ebook under a pseudonym, not because I thought it would change anything or hurt Linda, but because I needed to externalize the story, to put it outside of myself so maybe I could finally let it go. The book got a few hundred downloads, mostly from people interested in true crime or corporate manipulation stories, and exactly zero media attention, which was probably for the best given Linda's threats about what she'd do if I tried to expose her. Writing the book did help in an unexpected way. It forced me to organize my thoughts and see the whole picture, rather than fixating on individual moments of betrayal. I could trace Linda's manipulation from beginning to end, see how she'd identified me as the perfect tool, and then used me with surgical precision, and somehow making it into a narrative gave me distance from it. My therapist said it was a form of trauma processing, turning my experience into a story that had a beginning, middle, and end, even if the ending wasn't the justice I'd wanted. I started sleeping better, drinking less, actually engaging with my work again instead of just going through the motions. The anger didn't disappear, but it became less consuming, less central to my identity. I was still furious at Linda and Rachel and the unfairness of it all, but I was no longer letting that fury define every moment of my existence. 6 months after publishing the book, I received a message through the ebook platform from someone claiming to be a journalist interested in the story. She said she specialized in exposing corporate corruption and wealthy people who abused their power, and she'd recognized details in my book that matched research she'd been doing into Carmichael Capital Management. We met at a coffee shop in Manhattan, and she laid out what she'd discovered. Linda wasn't just a ruthless businesswoman who'd manipulated her divorce. She was potentially involved in several questionable deals that might constitute fraud or market manipulation. The journalist, whose name was Sarah, had been investigating Carmichael Capital for a year as part of a larger piece on private equity firms that operated in legal gray areas, and my book had provided her with context she'd been missing about Linda's character and methods. She wanted to know if I'd be willing to go on the record about what Linda had done to me, to be part of a larger expose that might actually have consequences. I told Sarah I'd think about it, knowing that going public would mean Linda would make good on her threats to destroy me professionally and personally. But Sarah showed me drafts of what she had so far. Testimony from other people Linda had manipulated or destroyed on her way to power. Financial records that suggested Carmichael Capital had engaged in insider trading and bid rigging. Connections between Linda's charitable foundation and politicians who'd helped her company win contracts. It was extensive and damning, the kind of investigative journalism that wins awards and actually changes things. Sarah said she had enough to publish without my story, but that my experience would add a human element that would make the piece more compelling and harder for Linda to dismiss as jealous competitors spreading rumors. She promised me she had lawyers review everything before publication, and that her outlet would defend any legal challenges Linda might mount. I told her I needed a week to decide, and she gave me her card and said she hoped I'd have the courage to stand up to someone who'd hurt so many people. I spent that week in a strange state of suspended decision, knowing that either choice would change my life again. If I participated in Sarah's article, I'd be declaring war on Linda Carmichael publicly, putting my name and face on accusations that would make me either a hero for exposing corruption or a bitter ex-husband who couldn't move on, depending on who you asked. If I declined, I'd maintain my tentative peace but live with knowing I'd had a chance to hold Linda accountable and chosen safety instead. My therapist refused to tell me what to do, saying it had to be my decision, but she did point out that I'd spent years feeling powerless and that participating might give me back some sense of agency. Marcus, who I'd reconnected with after getting my life back together, thought it was a terrible idea and begged me not to poke the bear again. Even David, the former employee who'd first exposed Linda's conspiracy to me, warned that Linda would fight back hard and that I should be prepared for a scorched earth response. In the end, I decided to do it. Not because I thought I'd win, or because I wanted revenge anymore, but because staying silent felt like letting Linda win even more completely than she already had. I met with Sarah and gave her everything. Recorded testimony about what Linda had admitted in her office, David's documents, Marcus's investigation files, my own contemporaneous notes from when I thought I was orchestrating Bob's downfall. I walked her through the entire timeline, explained how Linda had manipulated me and Rachel and probably dozens of other people over her career, and I agreed to be identified by name in the article because anonymous accusations wouldn't carry the same weight. Sarah spent 3 more months verifying everything, interviewing additional sources, having her lawyers review every sentence, and when the article finally published in a major business magazine, it detonated like a bomb in Connecticut's business community. The article was titled "The Puppet Master: How Linda Carmichael Built an Empire on Manipulation and Fraud," and it was devastating in its detail and scope. Sarah had found 8 other people besides me who'd been manipulated or destroyed by Linda, former employees who'd been scapegoated for her decisions, business rivals who'd been undermined through what appeared to be insider information, even a former friend who'd been systematically isolated after refusing to participate in one of Linda's schemes. The piece laid out potential securities violations, described the conspiracy to destroy Bob Henderson and use me as the weapon, and included expert testimony from forensic accountants about questionable transactions at Carmichael Capital. My story was prominently featured, complete with my photograph and quotes about how Linda had admitted manipulating me and offered me money to stay quiet. Within hours of publication, the article was trending on social media, picked up by major news outlets, and Connecticut's business elite were scrambling to distance themselves from Linda. Linda fought back exactly as hard as everyone predicted, within days of the article publishing. Her lawyers filed defamation lawsuits against Sarah's magazine, against me personally, and against several other sources named in the piece. She gave interviews claiming she was the victim of a coordinated attack by bitter ex-employees and her ex-husband's unstable friend, who couldn't accept that she'd succeeded after her divorce. Her PR team pushed stories painting me as obsessed and unreliable, dredging up my sabbatical from work and suggesting I'd had a mental breakdown. Some of Connecticut's business community rallied around her, issuing statements of support and calling the article a hit piece. For a few weeks, it looked like Linda might weather the storm through sheer force of will and money, that she'd bury the accusations under enough counter-narrative that people would forget or stop caring. But then the SEC announced they were opening an investigation into Carmichael Capital Management, based on the financial irregularities described in Sarah's article. Federal investigators started interviewing current and former employees, subpoenaing records, and digging into deals that Linda had worked so hard to keep buried. More people came forward with their own stories of Linda's manipulation, emboldened by the article and the official investigation, and suddenly the narrative shifted from bitter accusations to credible pattern of behavior. Linda's board forced her to take a leave of absence as CEO pending the investigation's outcome, and several major clients pulled their money from Carmichael Capital citing reputational concern. Her face, which had been plastered across business magazines as a success story just months before, was now associated with scandal and potential criminal charges. I watched it all unfold with complicated feelings. Vindication mixed with exhaustion and a lingering sadness that none of this would undo what she'd done to me or give me back the years I'd lost. The defamation lawsuit against me moved forward despite everything, because Linda was nothing if not committed to destroying anyone who challenged her. And I spent months giving depositions and burning through my savings on legal fees. Sarah's magazine covered my legal fees as part of their source protection policy, which helped, but the stress of being sued by someone with unlimited resources was its own special kind of hell. My name became associated with the scandal in ways I hadn't fully anticipated, and while some people treated me like a whistleblower hero, others saw me as the bitter ex who couldn't move on. And I had to accept that both narratives would follow me forever. The SEC investigation took 18 months, during which Linda remained technically on leave, but still wielded influence over her company through proxies and shell structure. In the end, they found enough evidence to charge Carmichael Capital with securities fraud, though Linda personally was only charged with civil violations rather than criminal ones, because she'd been careful to maintain distance between herself and the most egregious illegal activities. She settled with the SEC for $20 million in fines and a ban from serving as an executive at any public company for 5 years. But she faced no jail time and got to keep most of her personal wealth. The company itself imploded under the weight of the scandal, with her father essentially forced to sell it to a competitor at a fraction of its former value, and Linda's reputation in business circles was permanently destroyed. But she still had money, still had her house and her lifestyle, still had resources that most people could only dream of. The defamation lawsuits were eventually dismissed after Linda's settlement with the SEC essentially confirmed that Sarah's article had been accurate, but the legal battle had taken 2 years of my life and aged me in ways that had nothing to do with calendar time. I'd won in the sense that Linda had faced some consequences and I'd helped expose her corruption, but I'd lost in the sense that the process had consumed me again, pulled me back into obsessing over her when I'd been trying to move on. My career had suffered from the publicity and the distraction of the lawsuit, and while I didn't get fired, I'd been quietly moved to less important cases and knew my path to senior partner was probably over. The women I'd tried dating during this period had Googled my name, found the scandal, and either decided I was too complicated or assumed I was still hung up on my ex-wife, and they weren't entirely wrong. The first phone call happened 3 days after the mediation session, my mother's voice tentative and formal like she was afraid of saying the wrong thing. We talked for exactly 15 minutes as we'd agreed, sticking to safe topics like the weather and what she'd been reading and how Lucas was developing. She asked if I could send her a photo of him, and I said I'd think about it, not ready to share that piece of him yet even in digital form. After we hung up, James asked how it had felt, and I said strange, like talking to a distant relative I was trying to be polite to, rather than my mother. The second call the following week was slightly easier, my mother venturing into asking about my work and whether I was still nursing, showing interest in my life in a way she never had before. I told her about a difficult patient I'd had that week, and she listened without judgment or trying to fix it, just acknowledged that it sounded hard and said she was proud of how I'd handled it. Those words, "I'm proud of you," said so simply about something mundane, made me cry after the call ended in a way the bigger apologies hadn't. Our first supervised meeting with Dr. Chen happened 2 weeks after the initial mediation, and my mother brought a box of things she'd saved from my childhood. There were photos of me at every age, report cards, artwork I'd made in elementary school, a blanket my grandmother had crocheted for me before she died. She said she'd kept everything even after throwing me out, couldn't bring herself to get rid of the evidence that I'd existed and been loved, and she wanted me to have these things now for Lucas to see someday. I went through the box with hands that shook slightly, seeing my younger self smiling in photos taken before everything went wrong, before religion and control had twisted our relationship into something toxic. There was a photo of my father holding me as a baby, his face soft with love, and I had to look away because the cognitive dissonance was too much, trying to reconcile that loving father with the man who'd hit me 15 years later. Dr. Chen asked my mother what she'd learned in her individual therapy about why she'd been so controlling. My mother took a long breath and said she'd been working on understanding her own childhood, how her father had been violent, and her mother had coped by trying to control everything she could, creating rigid rules that kept them safe from his unpredictable rage. She'd internalized the message that control equaled safety, that deviation from prescribed paths led to danger, and she'd passed that trauma down to me without ever examining it. She said her therapist had helped her see that what she'd called faith and tradition was actually fear wearing a more acceptable face, terror that if she didn't control every aspect of her family's life, something terrible would happen. When I'd defied her by having a life and making choices she didn't approve of, it hadn't felt like normal parent-child differentiation, but like I was actively choosing danger, and she'd responded with the only tools she had, which were manipulation and control, and cutting me off when those didn't work. I asked her why James had been such a threat to her specifically, why she couldn't accept him even though he'd never been anything but respectful and good to me. She was quiet for a long moment, and then said honestly that James represented everything she couldn't control, a person who'd chosen me without her approval, who'd supported my independence instead of encouraging me to defer to her authority, who'd given me a vision of family that didn't include her at the center. She said she'd told herself it was about religion and morality, but really it was about losing her grip on me, watching me build a life that didn't need her input or blessing. The honesty was startling and painful, and exactly what I'd needed to hear for years. Dr. Chen asked how I felt hearing that, and I said relieved, that having her name the real issue instead of hiding behind religious justifications felt like progress even though the damage was already done. The third supervised session happened a month later, and I brought James with me this time at Dr. Chen's suggestion. My mother looked nervous when she saw him, her hands fidgeting with her purse strap, and for a long moment no one spoke. Then my mother stood and walked over to James and said she owed him an apology. She said she'd treated him terribly, had tried to destroy his reputation and his relationship with me, had blamed him for choices that were mine alone. She said he'd been a better husband to me than she'd been a mother, that he'd protected and supported me when she'd been trying to tear me down, and that she was grateful he'd been there when she hadn't been. James accepted her apology with more grace than she deserved, said he appreciated her saying that, but that the real work would be in changed behavior going forward. My mother nodded and said she understood, that she was committed to respecting their marriage and never again suggesting I should leave him. Dr. Chen facilitated a conversation between the three of us about what a relationship might look like going forward if things continued to progress. My mother said she wanted to be a grandmother to Lucas, wanted to be part of his life in whatever capacity we allowed, that she understood it would be limited and supervised at first. James said directly that his condition for allowing that was seeing consistent changed behavior for at least 6 months, that one backslide into old patterns and the door would close permanently. My mother agreed without hesitation, said she'd rather have a limited supervised relationship than no relationship at all, that she'd take whatever we were willing to give. I watched this exchange feeling oddly detached, like I was observing negotiations about someone else's child rather than my own. Part of me still couldn't believe this was happening, that my mother was actually doing the work and saying the right things and showing up consistently to these difficult sessions. Between sessions, the weekly phone calls continued, gradually becoming less awkward and more genuine. My mother told me about her Alzheimer's support group, how scary it was to know her mind was slowly failing, how she was trying to make amends for past mistakes while she still could. She asked about my nursing work and actually listened to the answers, asked follow-up questions that showed she'd remembered previous conversations. She sent cards for Lucas's half-birthday and for James's birthday, nothing manipulative or guilt-laden, just simple messages of love and acknowledgement. I found myself actually looking forward to the calls sometimes, glimpses of the mother I'd always wished for appearing in these carefully boundaried interactions. James noticed the shift in me and asked if I was getting too hopeful too fast, and I told him maybe, but that I'd learned to hold hope and skepticism at the same time, to want the best while preparing for the worst. 4 months into our reconciliation attempt, my mother asked if she could meet Lucas, just for an hour in Dr. Chen's office with all of us present. I'd known this request was coming but still wasn't prepared for how conflicted it made me feel. Lucas was almost 2 years old now, starting to form memories and understand relationships, and once he met his grandmother, there was no going back from that. If she regressed to her old patterns after bonding with him, it would hurt him, not just me. James and I talked about it for hours, weighing the risks against the possibility that this might be genuine, that my mother might have actually changed enough to be a safe presence in our son's life. We agreed to a trial meeting with strict conditions, 1 hour maximum in Dr. Chen's office, all conversation in English so we could monitor it, and we'd end it immediately if my mother showed any signs of trying to undermine our authority or make Lucas uncomfortable. The day of the meeting, I was so anxious I felt physically ill. We'd prepared Lucas as much as you can prepare a not-quite 2-year-old, told him he was going to meet Grandma Emma, showed him photos so she wouldn't be a complete stranger. My mother arrived early and was waiting in Dr. Chen's office when we got there, and I could see she'd been crying, her eyes red and her hands shaking. When Lucas toddled into the room holding James's hand, my mother made a small sound like a sob swallowed, and tears started streaming down her face. Lucas looked at her curiously. This crying stranger his parents had brought him to meet, and said his new favorite word, "Why?" which broke the tension and made everyone laugh. My mother knelt down to his level and said, "Because Grandma is so happy to finally meet you, sweet boy." And Lucas seemed to accept this explanation and went back to the toys Dr. Chen had set out. For the next hour, my mother was perfect. She followed Lucas's lead, didn't push for hugs or physical affection, just played alongside him and made gentle conversation. She asked James and me questions about Lucas's routines and preferences, respecting that we were the parents and she was just a visitor in his life. When Lucas brought her a toy, she received it like a precious gift and thanked him solemnly. When he got frustrated with a puzzle, she waited to see if we'd intervene before offering help. She told Lucas one story about when I was little and loved to color, keeping it light and age-appropriate, and not using it as an opportunity to guilt trip or reminisce about what she'd lost. By the end of the hour, Lucas was comfortable enough with her to wave goodbye, and my mother left with dignity even though I could see how much she wanted to stay longer, wanted more, wanted everything she'd missed. In the car afterward, James said he was impressed by how she'd handled it, that she'd shown real restraint and respect for our role as parents. I agreed, but said 1 good hour didn't erase years of bad behavior, that we needed to see consistency over time. Lucas fell asleep in his car seat, exhausted from the new experience, and I watched him in the rearview mirror and felt grateful that this version of my mother was the only one he'd ever know, that he'd never experienced the cruelty and control I'd grown up with. Dr. Chen called that evening to debrief and said she thought the meeting had gone well, that my mother had demonstrated genuine progress in respecting boundaries and deferring to our parental authority. She suggested we consider regular monthly visits if we felt comfortable, gradually increasing frequency if things continued to go well. Over the next 6 months, we established a rhythm of supervised visits every 3 weeks, my mother slowly becoming a familiar presence in Lucas's life. She never pushed for more than we offered, never questioned our parenting choices, never tried to undermine us or insert herself inappropriately. She brought small, appropriate gifts that she'd cleared with us first, followed our rules about sugar and screen time, asked before taking photos to share with relatives. The restraining order expired during this period, and we chose not to renew it, the legal boundary no longer necessary with the behavioral boundaries holding. My mother's Alzheimer's was progressing slowly, occasional moments of confusion or forgetfulness, but she was managing it with medication and cognitive exercises and seemed determined to stay sharp enough to enjoy whatever time she had with her grandson. Lucas started calling her grandma without prompting, would ask about her between visits, clearly forming an attachment to this gentle older woman who played with him and read him stories. Watching their relationship develop brought up complicated feelings. Joy that Lucas had this connection mixed with grief for what I'd missed as a child. Anger that it had taken my father's death, and an Alzheimer's diagnosis for my mother to finally do the work of change. James would find me crying sometimes after visits, and I'd try to explain that I was happy and sad simultaneously, grateful for what was but mourning what could have been if she'd done this work 20 years ago. He'd hold me and say that my feelings were valid, that reconciliation didn't erase history, that I could appreciate her current efforts while still carrying the weight of her past failure. Dr. Chen suggested we try an unsupervised visit after 9 months of consistent good behavior, just a few hours at our house with us present, but not actively monitoring every interaction. My mother was thrilled and terrified in equal measure, kept asking if there were rules she should know, what topics were off limits, whether she should bring any. I told her to just be herself, the version of herself she'd been showing up as for the past months, and trust that we'd speak up if something felt wrong. The visit went smoothly, my mother helping Lucas with an art project while James and I made lunch, all of us eating together at our kitchen table like a normal family. There was a moment when Lucas spilled his juice and my mother automatically moved to clean it, before catching herself and looking to us for guidance. And I saw in that pause how hard she was working to respect our authority, to not fall back into the controlling grandmother role she might have defaulted to. After lunch, Lucas wanted to show Grandma his room, and I followed them upstairs to supervise, but hung back in the doorway watching. My mother looked around at the nursery James and I had painted together, at the bookshelf full of stories we'd carefully chosen, at the photos of Lucas with our chosen family covering the walls. She said quietly, "You've built a beautiful life for him, a safe life. Thank you for letting me be a small part of it." There was genuine humility in her voice, acknowledgement that she was a guest in this life we'd created without her. And I felt something in my chest loosen slightly, a small piece of the anger I'd carried for so long releasing its grip. I told her she'd earned her place here by doing the work, that I'd had no guarantees she was capable of change, but she'd proven me wrong, and that meant something even if it didn't fix everything. As my mother's Alzheimer's progressed into the second year of our reconciliation, there were harder moments. She'd sometimes forget that James was my husband and refer to him as my boyfriend, or forget that we'd already discussed certain topics and bring them up again. Occasionally, she'd slip into her old patterns, starting to say something controlling or judgmental before catching herself and apologizing. The worst incident happened during a visit when she saw the birth control pills in my medicine cabinet and her face went dark, years of conditioning taking over before her conscious mind could stop it. She opened her mouth to say something, and I saw the war happening behind her eyes, old beliefs battling new understanding. And then she closed her mouth and walked away. She called me that night crying, apologizing for even the momentary reaction, saying she was still working on reprogramming decades of toxic thinking, and sometimes it bubbled up despite her best efforts. I told her I appreciated the apology, but needed to know it wouldn't happen in front of Lucas, that I wouldn't expose him to judgment about our family planning choices even accidentally. She promised she'd be more careful, suggested maybe we do visits outside our home for a while, so she wasn't exposed to things that might trigger her old patterns. It was a reasonable suggestion, and showed self-awareness about her limitations, so we agreed to meet at parks and museums and Dr. Chen's office for the next few months until she felt more stable. James said later that he was impressed by how she'd handled her own backslide, that taking responsibility and suggesting a protective measure showed real growth. I agreed, but said I'd always be watching for signs of regression, that one of the costs of her past behavior was my permanent vigilance about her current behavior. Lucas turned 3 during the second year of reconciliation, and my mother asked if she could throw him a birthday party. Nothing big, just her and Patricia and Aunt Marie and a few of James's family members. It would be the first time she'd hosted anything for us, the first time she'd be in the role of grandmother publicly with our approval. I was nervous about it, but agreed, figuring it was a test of whether she could handle a larger family gathering without reverting to her old controlling way. She rented a room at a community center and decorated it with Lucas's current obsession, dinosaurs, and made food she'd checked with us first to ensure it met our dietary preferences. When we arrived, she greeted James warmly and thanked us for trusting her with this, and I saw Patricia look surprised at how deferential my mother was being, how different from the domineering woman she'd been before. The party was actually lovely, my mother facilitating rather than controlling, making sure Lucas was having fun rather than staging perfect photos for social media. She introduced James's parents to her sisters without any awkwardness, acknowledging that they'd been there for us when she hadn't been. When Lucas asked her to play a game with him, she got down on the floor in her nice clothes and played without worrying about her dignity or what people thought. At one point, Aunt Marie pulled me aside and said she couldn't believe this was the same woman who'd cursed me in the parking lot at my father's funeral, that the change was so dramatic it was almost disorienting. I told her that facing death and dementia had apparently been the wake-up call my mother needed, that I wished it hadn't taken something so extreme, but I was grateful for the change even if it came too late to fix our relationship completely. Toward the end of the party, my mother asked if she could say something to everyone. I tensed immediately, worried she was about to make a scene or say something inappropriate, but James squeezed my hand and nodded for her to go ahead. My mother stood and said simply that she wanted to thank us for giving her a second chance she didn't deserve, that she'd lost years with her daughter and her grandson through her own stubbornness and cruelty, and that getting to be here today celebrating Lucas's 3rd birthday was a gift she'd never take for granted. She said she knew she couldn't undo the past, but she was committed to being better in whatever future she had left, and that she hoped Lucas would grow up knowing he was loved without conditions by all his family. It was a short speech, but it acknowledged everything that needed acknowledging without being maudlin or asking for sympathy, and several people had tears in their eyes when she finished, including me. After the party, driving home with Lucas asleep in the back seat, James asked how I was feeling about everything. I told him I felt cautiously at peace, that my mother had shown consistent changed behavior for almost 2 years now, that while our relationship would never be what I'd wanted as a child, it had become something workable in the present. I said I'd stopped hoping for her to be a different person and started accepting who she actually was. Someone who'd done terrible harm, but was genuinely trying to do better. And that acceptance felt like its own kind of closure. James asked if I thought I'd forgive her completely someday, and I said I didn't know if complete forgiveness was possible or even necessary. That what mattered more was that we'd found a way to coexist that didn't require me to sacrifice my safety or my boundaries. Lucas was 4.5 when my mother's Alzheimer's took a sharper turn for the worse. She started having trouble remembering recent conversations, would tell us the same stories multiple times in a single visit, occasionally forgot Lucas's name, and called him by my childhood nickname for me. We had to adjust our visits to be shorter and more structured, and I started bringing a notebook to write down important things she said so I could remind her later without making her feel embarrassed about forgetting. There were still good days when she was sharp and present, but the bad days were becoming more frequent. Her neurologist said she had maybe 2 more years of living independently before she'd need full-time care, and the clock on her remaining cognitive function was ticking louder with each passing month. One evening during a visit, my mother looked at me with sudden clarity and said she needed to tell me something while she still could. She said she'd been writing letters for Lucas to receive as he got older. Letters for his 10th birthday, his 16th, his 21st, his wedding day if he had one. She'd been working on them for the past year with help from her therapist, trying to leave him something of value beyond the limited memories he'd have of her. She asked if I'd keep them safe and give them to him at the appropriate times, and I promised I would. She also gave me a letter addressed to me, sealed, and said I could read it now, or save it for after she was gone, whatever I thought I could handle. I tucked it into my purse and told her I'd read it when I was ready, not sure if that would be tomorrow or 10 years from now. I read the letter that night after Lucas was asleep, sitting on our back porch with a glass of wine and my heart pounding. My mother's handwriting was shaky but legible, and the letter was 5 pages long. She detailed specific moments she regretted from my childhood, things I'd forgotten or buried that she'd been carrying guilt about for decades. She acknowledged that the birth control incident wasn't an isolated event, but the culmination of years of controlling behavior, that she'd been crushing my spirit slowly long before that final break. She wrote about watching me build a life without her, and feeling proud and devastated simultaneously. Proud that I'd had the strength to leave, but devastated by what she'd lost through her own actions. She said that loving me had always been easy, but respecting me as a separate person with her own choices had been impossibly hard until she'd lost me completely, and realized that control wasn't love at all. Rachel reached out to me about a year after the SEC settlement, sending a message through LinkedIn that I almost deleted without reading. She said she'd been following the news about Linda and wanted to talk to me about things I deserved to know, things that had been eating at her since everything fell apart. I was skeptical because Rachel had proven herself to be a liar and a co-conspirator, but curiosity won out over caution, and I agreed to meet her at a neutral location, a hotel bar in Stamford, where neither of us was likely to run into anyone we knew. She looked different when I saw her, older and tired in a way that expensive clothes couldn't hide, and she ordered a drink with shaking hands before she could even say hello. I sat across from her in silence, waiting for whatever confession or manipulation she'd planned, and after a long moment of staring into her glass, she told me that Linda had threatened her children, or rather, her future children, in a way that I hadn't known about. Rachel explained that when Linda had first approached her about cooperating with the conspiracy, Linda had done extensive research into Rachel's background, her family, her professional vulnerabilities, everything. Linda had discovered that Rachel's younger sister had a juvenile record that had been sealed, something involving drug possession that could have destroyed her sister's career and education if it became. Linda had also found out that Rachel's mother had some financial irregularities in her small business taxes from years ago. Nothing major, but enough to trigger an audit that could have been devastating to an elderly woman on a fixed income. Linda had laid all of this out during their first meeting, making it clear that cooperation meant protection for Rachel's family, while refusal meant Linda would systematically destroy everyone Rachel cared about. Rachel admitted she'd been terrified, not just for herself, but for people who had nothing to do with her affair with Bob, and that fear had kept her compliant long after the initial conspiracy had played out. What Rachel told me next made my blood run cold. Linda had maintained leverage over her even after the divorce and the payoff, requiring Rachel to check in periodically and confirm she wasn't talking to anyone about what had really happened. Linda had people watching Rachel, or at least Rachel believed she did, because twice when Rachel had considered going to authorities or talking to a lawyer, she'd received anonymous messages with recent photos of her mother's house or her sister's workplace. Subtle reminders that Linda's reach extended beyond their direct interaction. Rachel had been living in a state of controlled fear for years, terrified to speak up even as she watched Linda's empire grow and my life fall apart. She said she'd almost reached out to me a dozen times, but convinced herself that I was better off not knowing, that dragging me back into Linda's web would only hurt me more. It was only after Linda's settlement with the SEC and the forced sale of Carmichael Capital that Rachel felt the leverage might have weakened enough to risk talking. I asked Rachel why she was telling me this now, what she wanted from me, and she said she didn't want anything except for me to know that she'd been a victim too, in a different way than me, but still a victim. She acknowledged that she'd made terrible choices, that the affair with Bob had been real and wrong regardless of Linda's later manipulation, but she wanted me to understand that continuing the affair and cooperating with Linda hadn't been entirely her choice. I didn't know whether to believe her because Rachel had proven herself capable of convincing lies, but the fear in her eyes seemed genuine, and I knew enough about Linda's methods by now to know this kind of long-term leverage and intimidation fit her pattern. Rachel also told me something I hadn't known. Bob had reached out to her about 6 months ago, after reading Sarah's article, wanting to compare notes about what Linda had done to both of them. They'd met once, just coffee and conversation, and Bob had apparently been the one to encourage Rachel to contact me. That revelation led me to do something I'd never considered before. I tracked down Bob Henderson in Ohio and called him out of the blue to hear his side of the story. Bob was surprised to hear from me, the man whose life he'd helped destroy with his affair, but he agreed to talk and even suggested we meet in person since I was curious enough to reach out. I flew to Cleveland 2 weeks later and drove to the suburb where Bob was living in a modest ranch house that was probably worth less than his monthly car payment used to be in Greenwich. He answered the door looking like a completely different person from the arrogant vice president I'd seen at dinner parties. Thinner and grayer and wearing jeans and an Ohio State sweatshirt instead of designer suits. We sat in his small living room drinking beer from cans, and Bob told me his version of events, which added even more layers to Linda's conspiracy that I hadn't fully understood. According to Bob, his affair with Rachel hadn't been entirely his idea or initiative. Linda had been encouraging him to travel more for work, to attend conferences and networking events, and she'd specifically suggested he go to the company retreat in the Hamptons where he'd met Rachel, even though his presence there wasn't really necessary for business purposes. Linda had also been increasingly distant and cold in their marriage for months before the affair started, refusing intimacy and picking fights over trivial things. Behavior that Bob now recognized as creating conditions where he'd be vulnerable to an affair. He wasn't excusing his choices or his actions. Bob was clear about that. But he'd come to believe that Linda had been actively pushing him toward infidelity as part of her larger plan. Once the affair started, Linda had become suddenly interested in his schedule again, asking detailed questions about his meetings and trips that she'd never cared about before. And Bob realized in hindsight that she'd been documenting everything for her eventual use. Bob told me that he'd discovered something after the divorce that made him understand just how long Linda had been planning his destruction. While packing up his office after being fired, he'd found old performance reviews that Linda had apparently written but never shown him. Documents that painted him as incompetent and lazy, and that were dated months before the affair even began. These reviews had been used as justification for his termination and for voiding his severance package. But Bob had never received them at the time they were supposedly written, never been given a chance to improve or respond to the criticism. He'd shown them to an employment attorney who said they were likely backdated and created specifically to build a paper trail for his termination, but proving that would have required litigation against Linda and her family that Bob couldn't afford and wouldn't win. The level of premeditation it represented, creating false documentation months in advance of the affair that would justify his firing, showed a depth of calculation that went beyond anything I'd imagined. What haunted Bob the most wasn't the loss of money or status. He said he'd actually found some peace in his simpler life in Ohio, but the realization that his entire marriage might have been a strategic move by Linda from the beginning. He'd thought she'd loved him once, back when they first met. But looking back with the knowledge of how she'd orchestrated his destruction, he couldn't identify any moment in their 15-year marriage that felt genuinely real rather than performed. Linda had married him because her father wanted someone charming and presentable to be the face of the company while the Carmichael family maintained actual control. And Bob had served that purpose until he became more liability than asset. The affair, the exposure, the divorce, all of it had been Linda reclaiming control that Bob had never really possessed in the first place. He told me he'd tried therapy to process it all, but how do you process the idea that your entire adult life was someone else's long-term business strategy? Bob also shared something that Sarah the journalist had discovered but decided not to include in her article. Linda had apparently orchestrated similar manipulations with at least 2 previous romantic partners before she married Bob. Relationships that had ended in ways that benefited Linda financially or socially. One ex-boyfriend had been convinced to invest in a startup that failed spectacularly, losing his family's money but somehow leaving Linda's initial investment protected through a complicated corporate structure. Another ex-fiancé had been publicly humiliated after Linda discovered his infidelity, which Bob now suspected Linda had encouraged or even arranged, and the man had left Connecticut entirely to escape the social consequences. The pattern suggested Linda had been using people as tools for decades, probably learning it from her father who'd built Carmichael Capital through similarly ruthless methods. And Bob and I were just the most recent victims of a lifelong approach to relationships as transactions. Talking to Bob created an unexpected sense of camaraderie between us. 2 men who'd been weapons in the same war without realizing we were both being aimed by the same person. We stayed in touch after that meeting. Occasional emails and phone calls where we'd share updates about our lives and sometimes commiserate about the shared experience of being Linda Carmichael's puppet. Bob told me he'd started dating someone he'd met at his church, a teacher who knew nothing about his past in Connecticut and liked him for who he was now rather than what he'd represented. He said he was happier than he'd been in years, that losing everything had paradoxically freed him from the performance of being someone he'd never really been. I envied that ability to find peace in the wreckage, because even years after everything had fallen apart, I still felt contaminated by Linda's manipulation, still found myself questioning people's motives and looking for hidden agendas in every interaction. The final piece of Linda's conspiracy emerged from an unexpected source. Her own daughter reached out to me through an anonymous email account about 3 years after the SEC settled. Charlotte Carmichael had been 14 when her parents divorced, old enough to understand something terrible had happened, but young enough that the adults around her had tried to shield her from the details. Now she was in college, studying psychology, and she'd started asking questions about her family's history that led her to Sarah's article and eventually to me. Charlotte said she'd been doing research into narcissistic personality disorder and sociopathy for a class project, and the more she learned about the diagnostic criteria, the more she recognized her mother in the descriptions. She wanted to know the truth about what had happened, not the sanitized version Linda had told her and her brother, and she thought I might be willing to share my perspective since I had nothing left to lose. I met Charlotte at a coffee shop near her campus, and the resemblance to Linda was striking enough to make me uncomfortable. The same sharp features and calculating eyes, though Charlotte's eyes held something softer that her mother's never had. She recorded our conversation on her phone with my permission, saying she wanted to be able to review it later and process everything I told her. I walked her through the entire timeline, from discovering Rachel's affair through Linda's confession in her office to the SEC investigation and its aftermath, and Charlotte listened without interrupting, occasionally taking notes in a small leather journal. When I finished, She was quiet for a long time, and then she told me something that recontextualized everything I thought I knew about Linda's motivations and methods. Charlotte explained that Linda's father, the founder of Carmichael Capital, had been emotionally and psychologically abusive to Linda throughout her childhood, treating her like an employee rather than a daughter and constantly testing her loyalty and ruthlessness. He'd apparently created situations where Linda had to choose between her own interests and her siblings' welfare, rewarding her when she chose strategically rather than emotionally, and punishing any display of sentiment or attachment. Linda's mother had died when Linda was 12, and after that, her father had essentially raised her like he was grooming a corporate successor, teaching her that relationships were leverage and emotions were weaknesses to be exploited in others. Charlotte had learned all this from her grandmother's journals, which she'd found after her grandmother's death, and the portrait they painted of Linda's childhood was one of systematic training in manipulation and strategic thinking from the earliest age. This context didn't excuse what Linda had done to me or Bob or anyone else, but it explained how someone could become so thoroughly calculating and detached from normal human empathy. Linda had been raised by a monster to become a monster, trained from childhood to see people as tools and relationships as transactions, and she'd apparently excelled at the curriculum her father had set out. Charlotte said her grandfather was proud of Linda, even after the SEC scandal, because to him, the real failure hadn't been the manipulation or the fraud, but getting caught. The only sin in his worldview was incompetence. Charlotte herself was terrified of becoming like her mother, which was why she was studying psychology and trying to understand the family patterns she'd been born into, trying to break a cycle of abuse that went back at least 2 generations and probably further. I asked Charlotte what she wanted from me, why she'd sought me out specifically, and she said she was gathering testimony from people her mother had hurt as part of a personal project to document the full scope of Linda's damage. She wasn't planning to publish it or use it legally. It was more like creating a record that acknowledged what had really happened, versus the sanitized narrative Linda would inevitably try to leave behind. Charlotte also wanted to apologize on behalf of her family, even though she'd been a child when most of this happened and bore no responsibility for it, because she felt like someone should acknowledge the harm and express genuine remorse. The apology was unexpected and touching, and it reminded me that Linda's manipulations had created victims even within her own family, children who'd grown up with a mother incapable of genuine love or emotional connection. Charlotte told me something else that shifted my understanding of the endgame. Linda hadn't stopped manipulating people after the SEC settlement and the forced sale of Carmichael Capital. She'd simply changed tactics and moved into different spheres where her reputation as a ruthless operator was actually an asset rather than a liability. Linda had been consulting for private equity firms that specialized in hostile takeovers and corporate restructuring, essentially getting paid to do legally what she'd been doing illegally before, and according to Charlotte, her mother was thriving in this new role. The ban from serving as an executive at public companies didn't prevent her from consulting, and Linda had apparently rebuilt her professional network with people who admired her willingness to make hard decisions and destroy obstacles. She was making as much money as she had before, maybe more, and the scandal that had destroyed her company had somehow enhanced her reputation in certain circles as someone who wouldn't let ethics get in the way of progress. The realization that Linda had essentially won, that the consequences I'd fought so hard to deliver had barely slowed her down, was almost too much to process. I'd spent years of my life trying to hold her accountable, had sacrificed my own career advancement and peace of mind and relationship prospects, and she'd just moved laterally into a different role that rewarded the same behaviors. Charlotte saw the defeat in my face and told me something her therapist had said. People like Linda don't experience consequences the way normal people do because they don't have the emotional capacity to feel shame or remorse, the things that make consequences meaningful. Punishment doesn't reform them because they don't believe they did anything wrong. They just learn to be more careful about getting caught next time. The only real victory against someone like Linda was refusing to let them continue occupying space in your head, choosing to move forward rather than staying trapped in cycles of revenge and vindication. I left that meeting with Charlotte feeling strangely lighter despite learning that Linda had essentially escaped any lasting consequences. Something about hearing from her daughter, seeing the intergenerational damage that Linda's behavior had caused, made me realize that I wasn't Linda's only victim and that I'd actually gotten off relatively easy compared to her own children who'd had to grow up with her as a parent. Charlotte had given me permission to let go, in a way, by showing me that the fight against Linda was ultimately unwinnable because she operated by completely different rules than the rest of us. She would always land on her feet because she had no ethical constraints and unlimited resources, and trying to defeat her using normal methods was like trying to win a chess game against someone who could move pieces however they wanted. I started actually working on moving forward after that conversation, making genuine efforts rather than just going through the motions of recovery. I changed law firms, taking a position at a smaller boutique that handled immigration and civil rights cases. Work that felt meaningful in a way corporate law never had. The pay was worse, and the prestige was non-existent, but I found myself actually caring about the clients and the outcomes rather than just checking boxes. I started dating someone I met through a friend, a woman named Jennifer who worked as a social worker and had no connection to the Connecticut business world or the scandal that had defined my recent years. I told her about Linda and Rachel and everything that had happened on our third date, expecting her to run. But she just listened and then said that everyone has baggage, and mine at least came with an interesting story attached. Jennifer was good for me in ways I didn't fully appreciate at first, grounding me when I started spiraling into obsessive thoughts about Linda or fairness or justice. She had a practical, no-nonsense approach to life that came from years of working with people in crisis, and she didn't let me wallow in self-pity or righteous anger. When I'd start complaining about how Linda had gotten away with everything, Jennifer would point out that I had a job I liked, friends who cared about me, and the freedom to build a new life, while Linda was apparently so emotionally damaged that her own daughter was studying psychology specifically to avoid becoming like her. Perspective, Jennifer said, was about choosing which lens you looked through, and I could either focus on what Linda had taken from me or what I'd managed to preserve and rebuild despite her best efforts to destroy me. My relationship with Jennifer progressed slowly but steadily, and about a year after we started dating, she asked me if I'd ever confronted Rachel directly about the conspiracy, not the brief meeting where Rachel had confessed under duress, but a real conversation where I could say everything I'd been holding back. I admitted I hadn't because I'd been afraid of what I might say or do if I let myself fully express the anger I felt toward her role in my manipulation. Jennifer suggested that maybe I needed that confrontation, not for Rachel's benefit but for mine, to release the poison that was still circulating in my system years after the. She offered to come with me if I wanted support, or to stay away if I needed to do it alone, and after thinking about it for a few weeks, I decided she was right. I reached out to Rachel and asked if we could meet somewhere private where we could talk without interruption or time limits. She agreed immediately, probably sensing this was different from our previous brief encounters, and we met at her apartment since her husband was traveling for work. Rachel had clearly been dreading this conversation. She had wine already open, and her hands were shaking when she let me in, but I appreciated that she didn't try to avoid it or make excuses about why we couldn't meet. I told her I wasn't there to hurt her or threaten her. I just needed to say things I'd never gotten to say. And she nodded and sat down across from me like she was preparing for surgery without anesthesia. I told Rachel about the years I'd spent feeling like a fool, questioning every memory from our marriage and wondering what had been real versus what had been performance. I described the paranoia that had infected every subsequent relationship, the inability to trust anyone's motives or believe in anyone's sincerity, because she'd proven that the person you think you know best can be a complete stranger wearing a familiar mask. I explained how Linda's manipulation had been violating, but Rachel's participation in it had been devastating because I'd loved her, had built a life with her, had trusted her with parts of myself I'd never shared with anyone else, and all of that had been weaponized against her. The betrayal of the affair was almost secondary to the betrayal of letting herself become part of a conspiracy to manipulate me, of choosing self-preservation over any loyalty or honesty she might have owed to 12 years of marriage. Rachel cried through most of my monologue, these quiet tears that didn't interrupt or try to garner sympathy, and when I finished, she didn't defend herself or make excuses. She said she'd been a coward, that Linda had terrified her with threats against her family, but that terror didn't fully excuse the choices she'd made. Rachel admitted she'd told herself she was protecting me by not revealing Linda's involvement, convincing herself that my ignorance was a kindness when really it was just more manipulation. She acknowledged that the affair with Bob had been real before Linda got involved, that she'd been unhappy in our marriage in ways she'd never communicated, and that her unhappiness didn't justify cheating, but it explained why she'd been vulnerable to Bob's attention in the first place. The thing she felt most guilty about, she said, wasn't even the affair or the conspiracy, but the fact that she'd been relieved when it all fell apart, relieved to be out of our marriage, even though the method of escape had destroyed me. Hearing Rachel admit she'd wanted out of our marriage anyway, that on some level the conspiracy had given her an escape route she'd been too cowardly to pursue honestly, stung more than I expected. I'd spent years assuming our marriage had been good until Bob came along, that I'd been a good husband who'd been betrayed through no fault of my own, but Rachel's admission meant I'd been failing in ways I hadn't even known. She tried to soften it by saying the problems weren't all my fault, that she'd never communicated her needs and had expected me to read her mind. But the basic truth remained that I'd been married to someone who was unhappy enough to cheat, and I'd been completely oblivious. That obliviousness, that failure to see what was happening in my own marriage, was part of what had made me such a perfect tool for Linda's manipulation. I'd been so convinced I understood my own life that I hadn't seen all the ways it was being controlled by others. I left Rachel's apartment that night feeling like I'd finally closed a chapter that had been left open for too long. I didn't forgive her, exactly, but I understood her better, and understanding felt like enough. Jennifer was waiting up for me when I got home, and I told her about the conversation, and she held me while I processed the complex mix of emotions that came from finally getting honesty from someone who'd lied to me for years. The next morning, I woke up feeling lighter than I had in years, like I'd been carrying a weight I didn't fully recognize until it was gone. The anger toward Rachel hadn't disappeared entirely, but it had transformed into something more manageable, less consuming, more like a scar than an open wound. About 6 months after that conversation with Rachel, I got unexpected. Linda Carmichael had been. The charges were related to a new scheme she'd been running through her consulting work, something involving insider trading and wire fraud that the FBI had apparently been investigating for over a year. Sarah, the journalist who'd written the original exposé, called me to let me know before it hit the news, and she explained that Linda had apparently gotten overconfident after the SEC settlement, believing she was untouchable or smart enough to avoid detection. The evidence against her was substantial this time, including recorded phone calls and email trails that showed clear criminal intent. And Sarah's sources suggested Linda was facing serious prison time if convicted. The arrest had been public and humiliating. FBI agents at her home in Greenwich in front of all her wealthy neighbors, and Sarah said Linda had apparently broken down completely when they put her in handcuffs.